Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving deep into something that's been on my mind constantly since the tragedy involving Greg Biffle and his family. I've received hundreds of messages from you asking the same fundamental question. And honestly, it's the exact question that kept me up analyzing flight data for days. How does an aircraft accelerate beautifully, reaching speeds that should carry it safely into the sky, yet somehow fail to gain any meaningful altitude? That contradiction, that puzzle, is what we're going to unravel today, because understanding it might be the key to understanding what happened in those final, desperate minutes. Before we get into the technical analysis, I want to be clear about something. We're not here to speculate wildly or point fingers. We're here to understand, to learn, and hopefully to prevent something like this from ever happening again. The families affected by this tragedy deserve answers, and the aviation community needs to comprehend what signs were present in that flight data. When I first pulled up the ADS-B tracking data from that morning, I must have stared at it for hours. I've analyzed countless flight profiles in my career, and something about this one immediately triggered alarms in my head. The Citation departed Statesville's runway 10, executed what appeared to be a textbook rotation, wheels came off the pavement, and the aircraft began its climb out. Everything looked normal for those first few seconds, the kind of departure you'd see 1,000 times without giving it a second thought. But then, something changed. Something subtle at first, but increasingly alarming as seconds ticked by. The aircraft managed to reach approximately 1,200 feet, which is right around where pilots typically begin what we call the cleanup phase. This is when you start retracting flaps, transitioning the aircraft from its takeoff configuration into its cruise setup. It's a routine procedure, something every pilot does on every flight. But it's also a phase that demands stable, reliable power from your engines. You're asking the aircraft to maintain its climb while simultaneously reducing the wing's lifting surface area by bringing those flaps up. The engines have to compensate for that change, and if they can't, you're going to know it immediately. Here's where things get genuinely puzzling. The speed readouts show this Citation accelerating to nearly 200 knots. That's excellent performance. That's exactly what you want to see in terms of velocity. But here's the problem that made my stomach drop when I saw it. Despite that impressive airspeed, the aircraft stopped climbing. It leveled off. Then it began descending. Not gradually, not gently, but in a way that suggests the pilot was fighting desperately to keep that airplane in the air. After that initial drop in altitude, there's a brief attempt to regain some height, and then another descent, more pronounced this time. The whole profile looks like someone wrestling with an airplane that simply doesn't want to fly anymore. In my profession, when you see an aircraft depart normally, but then struggle to maintain any kind of climb gradient, your mind immediately goes to two primary culprits. Either something is catastrophically wrong with how the wings are configured, or you're not getting the thrust you need from your power plants. Now, the configuration issue, particularly something like taking off with incorrect flap settings or retracting them prematurely, I can almost eliminate that possibility. A sophisticated jet like the Citation 550 has enough safeguards and indications that misconfiguring the flaps without recognizing it is extremely unlikely. So that leaves us with the more troubling scenario. Were these engines producing the power they needed to produce? When I look at that zigzagging flight path, those bizarre oscillations in both altitude and heading, and the fact that this crew made the decision to return to the airport in such an unstable condition, I can't help but see the fingerprints of inadequate thrust, or worse, asymmetric thrust, where one engine is producing significantly less power than the other. Let me explain why that matters so much. If you lose power on just one side of a twin-engine aircraft, the airplane doesn't just slow down. It violently yaws toward the failed engine because the opposite side is still pushing hard. The pilot has to physically force the rudder pedal to the floor, using every ounce of leg strength to keep that aircraft pointed in the right direction. And if you look at the ADS-B track from this flight, that's exactly the kind of behavior you see. Constant corrections, pronounced turning to the left, the hallmarks of a pilot fighting asymmetric thrust. Now, I'm not standing here telling you definitively that the engines failed. I don't have that authority. And frankly, nobody does until the NTSB completes their investigation. But what I can tell you is that many elements of this flight profile closely mirror situations I've trained for extensively. Situations where thrust is insufficient right when you need it most. Let's rewind and look at what the data actually shows us from the moment this citation started its departure. The left turn after takeoff appears normal initially, standard procedure for leaving Statesville's airspace. But I've watched this track replay more than 30 times now, and it doesn't behave anything like a healthy citation climbing away from an airport. After breaking ground, reaching that 1,200-foot mark, right when the pilot should be cleaning up the aircraft and establishing a solid climb rate, something goes wrong. The speed increases beautifully to 197 knots, but remember, speed alone doesn't keep you airborne. You need that speed combined with sufficient thrust to generate the lift required to climb, especially when you're retracting flaps and reducing your wing's effectiveness. What happens next is textbook insufficient thrust behavior. The aircraft levels off when it should be climbing. It begins losing altitude when the pilot clearly wants to go up. Imagine being in that seat for a moment. You've just cleaned up your aircraft. You're advancing the throttles, expecting to see that reassuring climb rate, but instead, your altimeter is unwinding. That's the moment when ice-cold fear hits, because you know something is fundamentally wrong with your power situation. This pitch oscillation we see in the data is something I've experienced in the simulator during engine failure training, and it's a feeling that's burned into my memory. You pull back to hold your altitude, but your speed bleeds off rapidly. You lower the nose to regain that speed, but now you're descending quickly. Pull back again. The cycle repeats, each iteration eating away at your altitude and your time. A healthy Citation 550 with two strong engines would never fly like this. It would climb smoothly, respond crisply to control inputs, and maintain whatever flight path the pilot commands. But there's something else in this data that's harder to ignore the more you study it. The aircraft continuously changes heading, with particularly pronounced deviations to the left. An airplane flying normally doesn't spontaneously pull itself in one direction like that. But an airplane suffering from thrust asymmetry, where one engine is weak or failing while the other maintains power, will do exactly this. It wants to turn toward the weak side, and the pilot has to fight it constantly with rudder pressure. Now layer on top of that the weather conditions that morning. Marginal VFR means the pilot is already working harder than normal to maintain visual reference with the ground while controlling the aircraft. Workload is through the roof, and high workload combined with a potential engine issue is precisely what makes this phase of flight so incredibly dangerous. When I compared this flight profile to previous engine failure incidents I've studied, the similarities are striking. That same pattern emerges again and again. Climb normally, level off unexpectedly, rapid descent, desperate attempt to return to the nearest runway. All these indicators we're seeing, the altitude fluctuations that make no sense, airspeed increasing while climb performance vanishes, that persistent left turning tendency, the continuous pitch oscillation, they all point toward one conclusion. This aircraft was not getting balanced, sufficient thrust from both engines after the cleanup phase. I'm not making a final determination here, that's not my role. But looking at this data through the lens of someone who's spent years training for these exact scenarios, it's extremely difficult to conclude that this citation was operating with two healthy, powerful engines. In aviation, engine failure during the takeoff phase isn't just a concern, it's the nightmare scenario that keeps pilots awake at night. During this phase, your aircraft is still dangerously close to the ground. Your airspeed hasn't stabilized, your flaps are still in takeoff configuration initially, and the pilot has maybe 10-15 seconds maximum to recognize what's happening and react appropriately. When we advance those throttles and commit to leaving the runway, Everything hinges on 4 critical velocities that determine whether you live or die if something goes wrong. First is V1, the speed beyond which stopping on the remaining runway is impossible. Then there's VR, your rotation speed where you pull back and lift the nose. V2 is your target climb speed with one engine inoperative. And finally, there's VMCA, minimum control airspeed with one engine out. This is the slowest speed at which you can maintain directional control when one engine quits. Drop below VMCA, and it doesn't matter how skilled you are, the airplane will yaw uncontrollably, roll, and you're going down. So what actually causes engines to fail during this critical phase? Let me walk you through the most common culprits. The first, and perhaps most dramatic, is bird ingestion or foreign object damage at low altitude. When a bird gets sucked into that intake, it disrupts the carefully controlled airflow through the compressor stages, causing an immediate compressor stall or complete flameout. In the cockpit, you hear a solid thud, almost like someone hitting the side of the aircraft with a hammer. Then there's a vibration, followed by a sharp, stomach-dropping loss of thrust. If only one engine ingests a bird, the airplane immediately yaws hard toward that side. The second major cause is contaminated fuel, and this one is insidious because it often doesn't announce itself dramatically. Water in the fuel, sediment, microscopic impurities, these contaminants might not cause any issues during ground operations, but the moment you firewall those throttles for takeoff, all that contamination gets sucked into the combustion chamber. The engine starts choking, becoming unstable, and losing thrust progressively. This type of failure usually doesn't produce explosions or loud bangs. Instead, it feels like someone is slowly turning down the power, draining away your thrust when you need it most. Third on the list are mechanical failures. Turbine bearings that have been slowly degrading, fuel pumps that aren't delivering adequate pressure, a turbine stage that's not spinning at proper RPM. Any of these issues can significantly reduce thrust output. All of these problems can remain hidden during ground checks, only revealing themselves when you demand everything the engine has to give during takeoff. Another critical failure mode is thrust asymmetry, and this is what I keep coming back to when I look at the Biffle flight profile. If one engine reduces thrust or shuts down completely while the other continues producing power, the aircraft is violently pulled toward the weak side. In the cockpit, this isn't subtle. You feel it instantly. One of your feet has to shove the rudder pedal all the way to the stop just to keep the airplane pointed straight ahead. Finally, there's compressor stall or surge, a phenomenon that any turbine pilot dreads encountering. When the inlet airflow gets disrupted, the engine produces a distinctive bang that you can hear and feel throughout the airframe. Then, thrust drops to nearly zero, even though the engine itself is still spinning. It doesn't tear the airplane apart immediately, but it takes away the single most critical thing you need in that moment: thrust to climb and get away from the ground. When I take all of these potential failure modes and overlay them onto what we know about the flight, certain things start lining up in ways that are difficult to dismiss. The moment when climbing stopped occurred immediately after flaps were retracted. That's the single most sensitive point in the departure where engines must maintain stable, adequate power. The continuous up and down motion is a textbook sign of a pilot trying to hold minimum safe airspeed when thrust is insufficient. The airplane accelerated well but couldn't climb. That pronounced left turning we see in the ADS-B data is screaming thrust asymmetry to me. And here's something else that's significant. There's no indication of a major in-flight engine fire, no reports of flames visible from the ground during the flight portion, which makes gradual thrust loss or asymmetric thrust more likely than a catastrophic engine explosion. From a professional perspective, examining this flight profile against everything I've trained for and studied in accident reports, this flight matches many different types of engine malfunctions that can occur at the worst possible moment. Now let's shift our focus to the human element, because who is flying this airplane fundamentally determines the survival chances in an engine-out situation. On that Citation 550, there were 3 individuals holding pilot certificates, but only one person was properly type rated for the aircraft. Dennis Dutton, the former airline captain. This is someone with decades of experience operating under Part 121 regulations, who has completed countless hours of emergency training where engine failure scenarios are drilled repeatedly until the responses become almost reflexive. If anyone on that aircraft had the training and experience to handle an engine malfunction immediately after liftoff, it was him. But that's exactly what makes looking at how this airplane behaved so thought-provoking. Because the workload in that cockpit must have exceeded anything that could be managed effectively. Engine failure in an airline environment versus engine failure in general aviation operations are two completely different universes. In Part 121 commercial operations, when an engine quits, everything unfolds according to carefully rehearsed procedures. The captain flies the aircraft. The first officer handles the checklists and communications. Tasks are divided efficiently. One person keeps the airplane flying, the other troubleshoots the problem. But in general aviation, especially if you're flying single pilot or even with multiple crew members, but without strict standard operating procedures, workload explodes exponentially in those first crucial seconds. When engine failure happens right after liftoff, everything lands on one person's shoulders. You have to maintain the correct heading while the airplane is trying to yaw violently away from you. You have to hold your airspeed above VMCA while it wants to bleed off. You're pushing the rudder pedal so hard your leg muscles are screaming. You're managing pitch to avoid stalling. And simultaneously, you have to decide whether to continue climbing straight ahead or attempt to turn back to the airport. Only those who've been thrown into the simulator with an engine failure at 200 or 300 feet above the ground truly understand that sensation. You're pulling back trying to hold your target speed, but the airplane is yawing left because one engine is dead weight. You're pushing the rudder pedal with maximum deflection. You're trying to keep the wings level while watching your airspeed decay. And right in the middle of trying to stabilize all of that, you still have to make strategic decisions about where to go. Applying this scenario to the citation that morning, we can start to imagine some of what was happening inside that cockpit. If engine failure or severe thrust asymmetry occurred right after flap retraction, the pilot would have been continuously juggling rudder pressure, power management, pitch control, airspeed monitoring, and flap configuration while altitude was falling rapidly. If only one engine was weak, the airplane would yaw strongly to the left, exactly as we see recorded in the ADS-B track. Factor in marginal VFR weather conditions, where you're having to maintain visual reference with the ground while simultaneously fighting the aircraft, and the workload becomes suffocatingly intense. And amid all of that chaos, the biggest question looming over this entire incident is who was actually in the left seat. The pilot records give us three possibilities. First, Dennis Dutton, the only person type rated for the citation, though his certification required a qualified co-pilot. He had extensive airline experience and understood engine failure procedures better than anyone else on that aircraft. Second, his son Jack, a student pilot who clearly would not have been capable of flying a twin-engine jet requiring high-level qualifications. Third, Greg Biffle himself, who held a private pilot certificate with various ratings, but critically, no citation type rating. We can't know with certainty who was manipulating the controls during those final minutes, but just running through each scenario mentally reveals massive differences in likely outcomes. If Dennis was flying, he would have recognized asymmetric thrust immediately and known the procedures by heart. But even with all that experience, the workload could still overwhelm a single pilot when everything happens in 2 or 3 minutes. If someone else was in the left seat, they would have had almost no chance of successfully controlling an engine-out scenario at such low altitude. And that uncertainty makes this story even more haunting, because successfully managing engine failure after takeoff represents one of the harshest tests in all of aviation. When we place this picture alongside typical engine failure accidents throughout aviation history, everything starts crystallizing. I've chosen 4 specific incidents that every pilot studies repeatedly, and they all share one characteristic. Power loss immediately after takeoff produces behavioral signs so distinctive that you can identify them just from looking at the flight path. The first case is US Airways 1549, the Miracle on the Hudson. Both of that Airbus A320's engines ingested an entire flock of Canada geese, approximately 2 minutes after departing LaGuardia. Thrust dropped to essentially zero. The flight profile shows a pattern that should sound familiar. Climb to a few hundred feet, level off abruptly, then begin descending. Captain Sullenberger described feeling the airplane no longer climbing the instant thrust disappeared. Looking at this case, I'm not suggesting the Biffle aircraft suffered a bird strike, but that pattern, climb, plateau, descent, is disturbingly similar. The second case involves a Citation II that experienced contaminated fuel. The airplane departed normally, accelerated appropriately, but immediately after flap retraction, the engine started losing thrust. The pilot pulled the nose up, attempting to hold altitude, but that decision proved fatal. When power is insufficient, pulling back just puts you closer to stall speed. This Citation flight has one element that made me pause: zigzag heading and pitch oscillation, exactly like what we see in the Biffle Citation data. The third case involves a King Air that suffered mechanical failure leading to one engine shutdown at approximately 400 to 500 feet after takeoff. Strong yaw toward the failed engine, airspeed bleeding off rapidly. In this incident, ADS-B data showed a zigzag path where each time the pilot corrected heading, the airplane was immediately pulled back toward the dead engine. Comparing that to the Biffle flight data, the pronounced left turning makes me think of asymmetric thrust because that turning had a clear pattern. The fourth case is a Learjet that lost thrust balance, leading to uncontrolled roll just seconds after breaking ground. One engine lost thrust as the pilot was retracting flaps. The Learjet immediately yawed to one side. Bank angle exceeded 40 degrees almost instantly. The pilot even exclaimed on the cockpit voice recorder, "I'm struggling to keep it straight." That prolonged left-turning tendency in the Biffle Citation tells a similar story. Someone was trying desperately to prevent that airplane from entering an uncontrolled roll. When you place these 4 historical incidents side by side, and then add the Biffle flight profile to the comparison, something becomes very apparent. Whenever power loss occurs right after takeoff, the airplane exhibits nearly identical behavior patterns regardless of the specific aircraft type. Not because they're designed similarly, but because physics demands they react that way. I'm not stating definitively that the cause was engine failure, but when you examine these 4 proven cases, then look again at the Citation 550's flight profile, it's remarkably familiar. This isn't definitive proof, but it is a pattern. As we wrap up this analysis, everything we've examined, from the ADS-B flight behavior to the unusual turning characteristics, from the pitch oscillation to the crushing cockpit workload, from the 4 classic engine failure cases to the physics of thrust asymmetry, it all points toward one consistent conclusion. The Citation 550's flight profile that morning carries numerous signs that are compatible with insufficient thrust after takeoff. I'm not claiming that's the absolute verified truth. What I am saying is that through the perspective of someone who's flown professionally for many years and completed countless engine-out training sessions, what we observe in this flight data doesn't resemble the behavior of an airplane with full power available from both engines. But more importantly than any technical analysis, the final authoritative conclusion never belongs to me or anyone outside the official investigation. What we've analyzed here represents a professional perspective intended to help everyone understand why an airplane departing normally could deteriorate into such an unrecoverable state within just minutes. And regardless of what the ultimate cause determination is, the most heartbreaking aspect remains the human loss. 7 people on board that aircraft lost their lives in a flight that lasted less than 10 minutes. These were people with families waiting for them, futures planned out, loved ones expecting them at the destination. As a pilot, whenever I examine an accident, I don't just look at data points and numbers. I think about those final moments in the cockpit where someone was trying everything they knew to keep that airplane flying just a few more seconds, trying to bring the people behind them home safely. And I think about their families, shocked beyond comprehension, grieving, perhaps still unable to fully process that this actually happened. But from that profound pain, we still have an obligation to learn, to remember, so we don't repeat mistakes. The first lesson, and the most critical in any engine out situation, is that speed is life. If you cannot hold minimum control airspeed, all other piloting skills become completely meaningless. The second lesson addresses the limits of single pilot operations. Workload during engine out immediately after takeoff exceeds what one person can reasonably handle. That's why many veteran jet pilots openly state they would never fly a Citation 550 single pilot. The third lesson is specific to the Citation 550 itself. This aircraft isn't forgiving when thrust is lost. Its design demands near-perfect precision in airspeed and pitch control when operating on reduced power. Looking back at this entire tragedy, one thought continues haunting me. We'll never know exactly what happened in those final seconds without access to complete data. But if these analyses can help some pilot somewhere realize how genuinely dangerous engine failure during takeoff can be, or help them prepare more thoroughly, respect minimum speeds more seriously, or reconsider single pilot operations in complex aircraft, then speaking out about these issues is absolutely necessary. We're heartbroken by what happened, but if analyzing this incident helps even one person avoid repeating a similar tragedy in the future, then it's worth every minute spent studying it. If you found this analysis valuable, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future updates when the NTSB releases their preliminary and final reports. We'll be covering those as soon as they become available. Thanks for watching, and remember, we fly not just for ourselves, but for everyone who trusts us with their lives. Stay safe up there.